The ceasefire came at 1340 local, and by 1400, the shooting had mostly stopped, which in my experience meant nothing except that everyone was reloading. I had been on Veth 9 for 11 days. 11 days of border skirmish that the diplomatic channels kept calling an incident, while the bodies came into the aid corridor at a rate that didn't feel incidental to me. I was a sergeant first class with the Compact Liaison Medical Corps, which is a long title for a job that boils down to this. I kept human soldiers alive long enough for the real decisions to get made by people above my pay grade, and I tried not to resent the time it took the real decisions to arrive. On Veth 9, the real decisions had taken 11 days. The bodies had not waited. The Liaison Corps had deployed 12 personnel to Veth 9 when the border skirmish began. 4 of us were medical. The other 8 were translators, logistics coordinators, and 2 staff officers who spent most of their time on comm channels, arguing with people I never saw about things I was never briefed on. The Medical 4 ran the human-side triage intake and handled overflow from the Compact's own medical division when the numbers warranted it, which was most of the time. We had slept in 4-hour rotations and eaten when we could, and the 11 days had acquired that compressed quality that bad field assignments always have time flattened into a continuous present, each day indistinguishable from the one before except by which patients you remembered. The aid corridor was a converted cargo hangar on the Moon's equatorial plateau, requisitioned from the Velon Compact Transit Authority on day 3, when it became clear the field hospitals weren't enough. The ceiling was 40 feet up and hummed with climate systems that couldn't quite manage the cold. The smell was propellant and cold metal, and the particular chemical sweetness of compact tissue wound sealant, a smell I had come to associate with the 3 hours after a fight when you weren't sure yet who was going to make it. The temporary cots ran in 4 rows under yellow triage lights, and against the east wall there was a long folding table that had become my station for the duration. Past the folding table, recessed into the east wall, was a requisitions alcove where the supply crates were stacked. Not a proper room, just a notch in the hangar wall, deep enough to stand in and quiet enough that you could hear yourself think. The table held my kit in its standard arrangement: field med case on the left, 2 bioscan paddles in their holsters, a rack of analgesic canisters in 3 sizes, 4 boxes of closure strips sorted by dimension, a thermos of coffee that had been cold since morning, and a half-eaten bar of field chocolate in a foil wrapper that I had been rationing since day 7. It was the last sweet thing I had. Most days I didn't eat it. I just kept it there where I could see it, because some days you need the idea of something sweet more than you need the actual eating of it. The post-triage inventory was the part of the work that nobody's training adequately prepares you for. It sounds simple. Count what you used, note what you need, log the patient contacts. What it actually is, in the aftermath of 11 days of attrition pace fighting with a ceasefire that everyone is hoping holds and nobody is betting on, is a kind of accounting for what the day cost you, done methodically and without sentiment, because the methodical is what keeps you functional. You learn to do the counting before you let yourself feel anything, because if you feel it first you can't do the counting, and the counting has to get done. I was at 71 closure strips. The count was going to end in the low 80s, which meant I needed a resupply before tomorrow when the child appeared. I didn't hear her arrive. I was focused on the pad and the count, and when I looked up she was simply there, standing at the far end of my table, not quite close enough to touch it. She was small, 4 feet, roughly and slight in the way the Velon Compact's people were slight, with that careful economy of frame that always made me think of architecture rather than biology, everything purposefully placed. She was wearing a plain gray travel tunic that was too large for her at the shoulders, so the seams sat somewhere on her upper arms rather than where they were supposed to, and she was shivering, not from cold. I noticed that immediately because the hangar's climate system, however inadequate, was maintaining a serviceable temperature, And anyway, cold produces a different kind of shivering, heavier, slower, more muscular. This was the fine continuous tremor of a nervous system that had been running in a high alert register for too long and had not yet received permission to stand down. Her skin was gray-silver, the tone the compact called vel pale, and her eyes were very large and very dark and fixed on me with the watchful, careful attention of someone who had recently learned that the world could change without announcement. She had dark hair, straight and fine, that had come half out of whatever arrangement it had been put in, and one side of it had come loose around her jaw while the other side was still pinned. There was a smear of hydraulic grease on her left forearm that she was either unaware of or had decided to address later. She looked to be about 7 years old. There was nobody with her. I looked past her into the corridor. The hangar was still busy at 1600, medics moving between cots, 2 compact liaison officers near the main doors talking in low voices over a shared pad, a cluster of Kareth border soldiers at the triage intake desk who had been filling out paperwork unhappily for the better part of an hour, and there was no one looking for a small gray-silver child. I set down my closure strips. I turned to face her and I crouched, which brought me down to something closer to her eye level. In 11 days on Veth 9 I had learned 3 things in Velon trade tongue. Yes, no, and this will hurt a little. I used none of them. I just crouched and looked at her and waited, because you don't get useful information from a frightened child by leading with questions. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked at my table. The bioscan paddles, the closure strips, the thermos, the foil-wrapped chocolate. Then she looked at me again. "Are you a doctor?" she asked. Her standard was careful and accented, the accent of someone taught the language formally rather than by immersion, each word placed with deliberate precision. "Something like that," I said. She absorbed this. "What is the something?" "I'm a field medic," I said. "I fix people when they're hurt and I try to make sure they stay fixed." She nodded slowly, as if this explanation filed into a category she already had. "Are you frightened?" I asked. She considered this with the gravity of a child who has been taught that questions deserve genuine engagement before answering. "I was," she said. "Before." "That makes sense," I said. "It was a loud day." She looked at me for another moment. Something in the set of her shoulders eased by a small degree, the kind of ease that comes not from being told everything is fine, which she would have recognized as untrue, but from being spoken to plainly about the obvious. I stood up slowly, no sudden movements, and I picked up the chocolate bar and unwrapped the remaining half and broke off a square. There were 4 left. I held it out across the table to her. She looked at it. She didn't take it immediately, which was correct. A careful child doesn't take things from strangers without looking first. "It's sweet," I said. "Human sweet, which is a specific kind. It won't hurt you." The compact medics cleared the basic compatibility list 3 days into the deployment. I checked then and I've checked since. Your biology can process this particular type of confection without adverse effects. I paused. "It also tastes better than it looks." She studied it for another moment. Then she reached out and took the square. She held it and looked at it, and then she put it in her mouth, and something in her face changed. Not dramatically. She wasn't a dramatic child. I could see that already, but the fine shivering eased by a degree, and her eyes lost the fixed watchful quality and became, briefly, just the eyes of a 7-year-old who had eaten something unexpectedly good. "It is sweet," she said, with the air of someone reporting a finding. "I think so too," I said. "My grandmother made something similar before she died. The field version isn't as good, but it keeps well and it travels, and sometimes keeping well and traveling is the more important quality." She thought about this with that same careful engagement. "What is a grandmother?" "A parent's parent. An older woman who feeds you things and worries about you, whether you need worrying about or not." "Oh," she said, "I have one of those. She is very old and she also worries." "Then you know exactly what I mean." She nodded. She was still holding the remaining bit of the square. She had eaten most of it but saved a piece, rationing without being told to, which told me something about her, and she looked at it thoughtfully and then at me. "Are there more battles?" she asked. The word she used was the trade tongue one, kethvar, which translates more precisely as loud disagreements that hurt people, and she said it in a tone that tried to be matter-of-fact and didn't quite manage it. "Not today," I said. "The loud disagreements have paused." My attendant said they paused before. "They did," I said, "twice. We're working on making this one stick." I picked up my inventory pad because the count was still at 71 and I needed to finish it, but I angled myself so I wasn't turning away from her. "What's your name?" She hesitated. Just a half second, barely noticeable, but I caught it. It was the hesitation of a child who had been instructed to be careful with names, which meant someone had given her specific guidance about this, which meant she wasn't here by accident. "Shiri," she said. "Daven," I said and tapped my chest with 2 fingers. "You can sit down if you want. That stool isn't being used." She looked at the stool at the end of my table. She came around and sat on it neatly, with the straight-backed, careful posture of a child who has been taught how to sit in formal settings, and applied it to a field station stool without apparent irony. She looked at my table and at my hands moving over the inventory. "What are those?" she asked, nodding at the closure strips. "When someone has a cut that needs to stay closed while it heals, these strips hold it together. They adhere to the skin on both sides of the wound and apply gentle, constant pressure. Then, when the tissue has knit sufficiently, they release on their own." "Do they hurt when you put them on?" "A little, but considerably less than the alternative, which is leaving the wound open." She seemed to find this answer satisfactory. She finished the last piece of her chocolate square. "Do you fix many people?" "As many as need fixing," I said. "More than I'd prefer." "Why more than you'd prefer?" "Because if I have to fix someone, it means something hurt them first. My preference would be for nobody to get hurt, which would put me out of a job but would be a significant improvement overall." She was quiet for a moment. I was on 81 closure strips now, getting close to the end. Down the row from us, a Kareth border soldier, plasma grays across his left shoulder, coming along well, had fallen asleep in his cot, which was good news. Sleep was good news. Sleep meant the analgesics were working, and the body had decided it was safe to do the slower work of healing. "My mother says something like that," Shiri said. "What does your mother say?" "She says a person who is glad to fight has already stopped thinking clearly." She paused. "She says it more formally than that. There is a compact word for it that doesn't translate exactly, but the meaning is the same as what you said." "Your mother is right," I said, "and she's in good company. Most of the people I've respected in this line of work would say the same thing." Shiri seemed pleased by this. Not demonstratively, again. She wasn't a demonstrative child, but something settled in her posture that hadn't been settled before. She looked at my thermos. "What is that?" "Coffee. It's cold and it's not good anymore." Even when it was hot, it was mediocre, field issue, not the real thing. "What is coffee?" "A drink humans use to stay awake and alert. It has a bitter taste and a particular smell, and it works less reliably than advertised, but we drink it anyway." "Why drink it if it doesn't work well?" "Tradition," I said, "stubbornness, 2 things humans are very good at." For the first time she smiled. It was small and careful, the smile of a child who had learned to manage what she showed, but it was real, and it changed her whole face, shifted it from watchful to present, from guarded to simply there. The shivering, I noticed, had mostly stopped. I finished the closure strip count, 84, which meant I needed a resupply request before 1800, and moved on to the analgesic canisters. Shiri watched me work with the focused attention of someone genuinely interested in the process, not just waiting for me to say something else. After a while, she started asking questions again. They were specific questions, precise and sequential, the kind a child asks when they've been taught that questions are worth asking carefully. She asked about the bioscan paddles. I showed her how one worked, switched it on, let it scan my own hand, showed her the display readout with the heat pattern and the tissue density map. She held it and studied the display with her head tilted slightly to the left, and she asked what the different colors meant, and I told her, and she asked 2 follow-up questions that demonstrated she had actually processed the first answer before generating the second. "It's a map," she said. "Yes," I said, "a map of what's happening inside instead of outside." She handed it back to me with the same careful deliberateness with which she'd taken it. "We have something similar," she said, "but it makes a sound instead of a picture." "What kind of sound?" "It depends on what it finds," she said. "Healthy tissue makes a low, steady tone. Damage makes a higher tone. Pain makes no sound at all." "Why does pain make no sound?" She thought about this. "My mother says it's because pain is already speaking for itself," she said. "The machine just listens for what can't speak." I put the bioscan paddle back in its holster. I thought about what she'd said for a moment. "Your mother thinks clearly," I said. "She thinks about most things for a long time before she says them," Shiri said. "She says that words are irreversible and you should mean them before you use them. That's a hard standard to maintain." "She manages it," Shiri said, with the same tone of simple factual confidence she'd used before. Her mother was the fact. Other things were subject to uncertainty. Her mother was not. She asked about closure strips next, and I gave her one still in its sterile packaging to examine. She turned it over in her fingers with the careful attention of a child examining a tool she intends to understand rather than just use. She asked how they adhered, and I explained the material, a biocompatible polymer that bonded with skin proteins without triggering inflammatory response. She asked how they knew when to release, and I told her they were calibrated to lose adhesion as the tissue pH normalized, which was one of the proxies for healing. "So they listen to the body," she said. "In a manner of speaking, yes. Like the compact scanner," she said, "listening for what can't speak." I looked at her. "Yes," I said, "exactly like that." She held the closure strip for a while after that, not examining it anymore, just holding it, and I went back to the canister count. The afternoon moved around us, the sounds of the aid corridor, the beep of equipment, the low voices, the occasional footstep, and Shiri sat on the stool at the end of my table and held the closure strip and did not shiver. She asked how long humans lived, and I told her, and she said that was shorter than she'd thought, with the tone of someone recalibrating a prior estimate rather than expressing distress. I asked how long the Velon Compact's people lived, and she told me, and the number was long enough that I did some private recalibrating of my own. "Does it bother you," she asked, "the shortness?" "Sometimes," I said honestly. "Less than it used to. You stop noticing the length of the container eventually and start noticing what you put in it." She thought about this for longer than most of the other things I'd said. "My grandmother says something like that," she said at last. "She says that the measure of a life is not its span but its weight." "Your grandmother is also right," I said. "You come from a family that's right about things." She smiled again. The second time was easier than the first. I gave her a second square of chocolate at 1640. She accepted it with the same brief moment of looking before taking, which I had come to understand was not suspicion, but consideration. A child who had been taught that receiving something required the same deliberateness as giving it. She ate it slowly, in small pieces, and she told me about a food from her home that was also sweet but made from something that grew near the water, and she described the taste in precise and somewhat abstract terms that I couldn't quite translate into any flavor I knew. But I listened and asked questions, and she answered them with the same careful engagement she brought to everything. She did not tell me more about herself beyond the name. She did not tell me where her attendant was or how she had come to be alone in the aid corridor or what she had been doing in this part of the hangar in the first place. Children in crisis, even composed children, even children who have been taught how to sit and how to ask questions and how to say words that mean them, often don't volunteer the connective tissue of how they arrived at a moment. They deal in the immediate. The immediate was my table and the closure strips, and the chocolate and a strange human who hadn't asked her to explain herself. That was enough for both of us. At 16:52, the aide arrived. I heard him before I saw him, quick footsteps with the rhythm of someone moving through a crowd with both authority and urgency, the two-beat pattern of a person who has somewhere to be and knows he's late to it. Then he was at the edge of my table, a compact male in civilian transit aid colors, shoulder badge in the compact's administrative registry that I could identify as significant but not translate precisely, and he was looking at Shiri with an expression that mixed relief and controlled alarm in almost equal measure. "Shiravel," he said in trade tongue, and his voice was measured and low and extremely careful. "You are not where you should be." Shiri's posture changed. Not dramatically, she didn't flinch, didn't pull back, but a degree of composure settled into her that had been absent, a particular kind of self-possession that was different from the careful ease she'd had at my table, as though she had put something on. "I know," she said in trade tongue. "You need to come with me now," he said. He was not unkind, but he was urgent, and he reached out toward her shoulder with the grip of someone who was going to guide rather than ask. I don't know exactly what made me step between them. Training is the honest answer. 11 days in a joint aid corridor with both Compact and Kareth personnel had calibrated my read on the difference between an adult legitimately collecting a child and an adult handling a child with more urgency than the child had prepared for, and Shiri had not prepared for this. Her stillness when his hand reached toward her was the specific stillness of a child who has gone somewhere internal because the external was moving faster than they'd been told it would. I moved around the end of the table and put myself in the space between them, not aggressively. I didn't change my posture or raise my hands or alter my voice. I just moved so I was there, and I said, in the trade tongue I had, "One moment." The aide looked at me. I could see him running the calculation, Compact Civilian Aid, Human Liaison Corps Sergeant, Compact Requisitioned Facility, 2 hours post-ceasefire, child who was clearly known to him and clearly not where she was supposed to be, and the calculation had enough variables in it that it took him a moment. "The child is in my care," he said. "I can see that you're here for her," I said. "She can go with you in a moment. I'm completing a post-incident welfare observation." This was not entirely accurate. Shiri didn't need welfare observation in any clinical sense. But children in aid corridors in the aftermath of armed engagements fell within the scope of post-incident welfare protocol, and the aide's expression told me he knew enough of the protocol to know I wasn't entirely outside my authority. Shiri said quietly from behind me, "I am all right, Marin." The aide, Marin, looked at her. The relief in his expression was proportionally larger than his composure could quite contain. "Your mother," he began. "I know," Shiri said. The 2 words carried the weight of a child who understood exactly what those 2 words were standing in for. She slid off the stool and came around to stand beside me. She was neat and composed and holding the closure strip in her left hand, and she looked up at me with her large, dark eyes. "Thank you," she said, in standard, not trade tongue. "Any time," I said. I meant it as a general thing, the kind of thing you say, but she received it with the same deliberateness she brought to everything, as if noting it for the record. She held out her hand, the hand with the closure strip in it, toward me. "Keep it," I said, "for when something needs holding together." She looked at it for a moment. Then she put it carefully in the pocket of the too large gray tunic, touching the pocket briefly with her fingers to confirm it was there. Then she followed Marin, who had already turned and was moving back through the aid corridor with the purposeful step of a man who had been looking for something precious for an hour and was going to deliver it quickly before anything else could happen. I went back to my table. I picked up my inventory pad. I was trying to remember where I'd been in the canister count when the corridor changed. I know how to describe it because I've felt it before, in a dozen different environments: staff officer walkthrough on a combat base, diplomatic party at a joint station, senior compact official moving through a civilian checkpoint. There is a specific quality to a room rearranging itself around a person of weight. It is not noise, not usually. It is the opposite of noise. It is the subtle contraction of everything else, the distributed redistribution of attention toward a fixed point, the collective unconscious shift of a room that knows, without being told, that someone significant has entered it. I looked up. The woman came through the far end of the aid corridor at a measured walk, unhurried, and Marin was at her left shoulder and Shiri was at her right hand, and she was not wearing insignia. No rank marks, no court identifiers, no compact formal colors. She wore a plain charcoal travel garment, high-collared, well-constructed but without ornamentation, and her hair was dark copper, pulled back in a way that was practical rather than decorative, and there was nothing about her that announced anything. Except that every compact personnel in the corridor had gone very still. She was tall, gray-silver skin a shade deeper than Shiri's, with the particular quality of the deeper velpale that appeared in compact portrait galleries as the reference tone for the imperial line. I knew this because one of the liaison translators had spent an educational 45 minutes during day 4 explaining compact visual protocol to anyone who would listen, and I had been doing inventory and had listened. Amber gold eyes, sharp and clear, and moving through the corridor with the specific attention of someone who has spent a long time developing the habit of missing very little. She was looking at me. She walked through the corridor at the same measured pace, and the crowd parted for her the way it does for people who have never had to ask for it, and she stopped at my table. Marin stopped 2 steps behind her. Shiri was holding her hand. The woman looked at me. Then she looked at my table, the bioscan paddles, the sorted closure strips, the cold thermos, the foil-wrapped chocolate with 2 squares remaining. Her gaze was not evaluating in the way that senior officers' gazes often are, noting deficiencies. It was more like reading, taking in what was there in order to understand what had happened at it. She looked at me again. Shiri tugged at her hand and said something in a compact dialect I didn't have, fast and low. The woman bent her head toward the child, a degree of inclination that was simultaneously attentive and completely natural, the posture of someone who has been bending toward this child for 7 years and does it without thinking. Shiri said it again, and I caught 2 words in the rush, Kethvar and Sharat, which meant loud disagreements and sweet. The woman straightened. She said in standard directly, "Marin tells me she was here for almost an hour." "Yes," I said. "He tells me you performed a welfare observation." I looked at Marin, who had composed his face into something diplomatically neutral. "She seemed like she needed somewhere to sit," I said. The woman was quiet for a moment. She looked at the stool. "She told me you explained what grandmothers are," she said. She didn't know the word. It came up naturally. "She also told me," the woman said, "that you said humans are very good at tradition and stubbornness." I believe that's accurate. Something moved through her expression, not amusement exactly, but adjacent to it, the quality of something recognized rather than simply found. It lived in the amber gold eyes and only barely reached the rest of her face. "She thought it was funny," she said. "She doesn't usually find things funny in aid corridors." "She asked good questions," I said. "The funny things came up during the answers." She looked at me for a long moment. Around us in the corridor, nobody was moving. The 2 liaison officers near the main doors had stopped their conversation mid-sentence. The Kareth border soldiers at the intake desk had put down their paperwork without appearing to notice they'd done it. My patient 3 cots down, the one with the shoulder graze who had been sleeping, had woken up and was lying very still looking at the ceiling. None of it was aimed at me. It was aimed at her, but I was in the center of it, holding an inventory pad. "What is your name, Sergeant?" she said. "Davin Holt," I said. "Sergeant First Class, Compact Liaison Medical Corps." "How long have you been on Veth9, Sergeant Holt?" 11 days, ma'am." She nodded once slowly, with the deliberateness of someone choosing to retain information precisely rather than approximately. "Marin," she said. She did not turn her head. "Yes," Marin said immediately. "I'll need a moment with the sergeant." The silence that followed was brief and very complete. Marin said, "Of course," and took 2 measured steps backward. Shiri let go of her mother's hand without being told to, which told me she'd been in this situation before, the situation of understanding that her mother needed space for a conversation that wasn't for her. She stood beside Marin with her hands clasped in front of her, composed and patient, and she looked at me once with her large, dark eyes, and something in them said, "This is all right." The woman walked around the end of my table, past the crates of supplies, toward the requisitions alcove in the east wall. I followed her because she was going there, and it seemed like the correct thing to do, and because I had been in the liaison corps long enough to know that when someone of significant authority chooses to have a private conversation with you, the correct response is to be present for it without making them ask twice. In the alcove, with the supply crates stacked around us, and the yellow triage light overhead, and the sounds of the corridor present but muffled by the angle of the wall, she turned to face me. She was not much shorter than me. The amber gold eyes were direct and entirely focused, and up close the quality of attention I had felt from across the corridor was more pronounced, not intimidating, not aggressive, just present. The attention of someone who had spent years developing the habit of seeing what was actually in front of them. "You didn't know who she was," she said, not a question. "No," I said. "What did you think when you first saw her?" I answered honestly because it seemed like the only appropriate register for this alcove and this woman. I thought she was a child who was frightened and alone and had been in a difficult day, and that my table had a stool that wasn't being used. "That's what you thought," she said. "Yes." Not whose child she might be. Not what it might mean that she was in a military aid corridor without a visible escort. "Those things occurred to me," I said, "eventually, but later." She looked at me for a moment. "My senior aide is very thorough," she said. "He has a complete account of the last hour. I know about the chocolate, both squares. I know you showed her the bioscan paddle and let her hold it. I know you gave her a closure strip. And I know that when Marin arrived and reached toward her shoulder, you moved between them before you understood who any of us were." "That last part may have been an overreach," I said. "No," she said, "simply the way people state things they've already decided. It wasn't." She let that sit for a moment. Outside the alcove, the corridor continued its work, the low voices, the soft beep of equipment, the footsteps of medics moving between cots. "Was she still shivering when you first saw her?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "She does that," the woman said, "after engagements. She has since she was 4 years old. Her body doesn't know how to stop running hot when the day has been loud. Her attendant knows how to manage it. There are things that help, specific things, and her attendant carries them." A pause. Her attendant was separated from her in the movement through the corridor when the ceasefire announcement came. The crowd shifted quickly, and Shiri moved the wrong way, and the attendant moved the right way. And by the time it sorted out, Shiri was in this part of the hangar and her attendant was in another part of it entirely. "She didn't seem distressed," I said. "By the time I noticed her, she was managing it." "She was sitting at your table," the woman said. "Yes." Eating chocolate. Yes. And holding a closure strip. Yes. Something shifted in her face, not the near amusement from before, something quieter than that, harder to name. She told me she asked you about grandmothers, she said. She didn't know the word, I said again. It came up when I was explaining why the field chocolate wasn't as good as the real thing. She told me that too, the woman said. She told me you said your grandmother made better chocolate. She wanted to know if you missed her. A pause. I don't know what you said. She didn't tell me that part. I told her yes, I said, that I missed her, and that missing someone well is one of the things you learn to do over time. The woman was quiet for a moment. She told me you said humans are good at tradition and stubbornness, she said. I stand by that, I said. She laughed, the woman said. She told me she laughed. She doesn't often laugh during HFY days. She is very composed. She was taught to be composed and she works at it, and on most days she manages it. On HFY days she manages it especially hard. The amber gold eyes held on me. She laughed at a folding table in an aid corridor while a human sergeant told her about field chocolate and closure strips, and the shivering stopped. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything useful to say. I'm going to tell you something, Sergeant Holt, she said, because I think you have earned the right to understand what has been happening in this corridor. I waited. My name is Velshara An, she said. I hold the title of Empress of the Compact Interior, first voice of the Velan Accord, and signatory to the Veth 9 ceasefire negotiations that concluded at 1340 today. She paused, in the way of someone allowing information to land before continuing. I am present on Veth 9 without insignia, because the negotiations required my physical presence at the station, and my formal presence in this aid corridor in the hours immediately following the ceasefire would have created complications during an already complicated afternoon. I looked at her. I looked at the corridor, where Marin was standing with a diplomatic expression, and Shiri was standing with her hands clasped, and nobody in the room was moving at the normal pace. I looked at my table, with the foil-wrapped chocolate and the 2 remaining squares. I looked back at Velshara An, Empress of the Compact Interior, who was standing in a requisitions alcove in a cargo hangar on a border moon, and watching me with amber gold eyes that missed nothing. She asked me about bioscan paddles, I said. Yes, the Empress said. She told me pain makes no sound because it's already speaking for itself. That's from something her grandmother told her, the Empress said. Her grandmother says it about grief. Shiri applied it to the scanner. She does that, takes things and puts them somewhere else, and they still work in the new place. She gave a good answer, I said, about the closure strips listening to the body. What did she say? I told her. The Empress listened, with the same complete attention she brought to everything. Yes, she said when I'd finished, that's her. We stood in the alcove for a moment. I was aware that I should be feeling some version of alarmed or destabilized. I was a sergeant first class who had just learned that he'd spent an hour feeding chocolate to the daughter of the Empress of the Compact Interior, while the Empress was 3 corridors away signing the document that ended 11 days of people getting hurt on Veth 9. And I was aware that I did not feel those things, particularly. What I felt was quieter and harder to name. The particular quality of a moment that has already happened asserting its completeness, independent of what it turned out to contain. Is she all right? I said. The Empress looked at me. She's not hurt, I said. I know that, but she was alone in a difficult place for a while, and the shivering, I just want to know she's all right, not as a medical question, as the other kind. The Empress was still for a moment. The quiet in the alcove was complete enough that I could hear the distant beep of a bioscan unit from down the row, and the faint climate system hum from the ceiling 40 feet above us. She is with her attendant, the Empress said. She is telling him about bioscan paddles and the way humans make sweet things. She is telling him that you have a grandmother, had a grandmother who made better chocolate than the field version, and that you said missing someone well is something you learn over time. The amber gold eyes held something that was not quite any of the emotions I could name, but was in the territory of several of them at once. She is not shivering. Good, I said. She is also, the Empress said, holding a closure strip in her left hand and has been since she left your table. I looked at the remaining 2 squares of chocolate in their foil wrapper on my table, visible from where we stood. She's a careful child, I said. Yes, the Empress said, she is. We stood there another moment. I became aware that I had been in this alcove with the Empress of the compact interior for several minutes, and that the people in the corridor outside had been very patient about it, and that there were things she needed to do with the rest of her afternoon that did not involve a cargo hangar and a human sergeant's inventory count. I'm not going to make a formal occasion of this, she said, as if reading the consideration. That would require a different kind of paperwork than either of us wants to generate today. The quality in her eyes that was adjacent to amusement appeared again briefly, and you wouldn't want it. I'd prefer not, I said honestly. What I want you to know, she said, is that I know what happened in the last hour. I know all of it in the order it happened, and I know that none of it was part of your assignment. You were doing inventory. The child was not your responsibility. No, I said. You fed her, the Empress said. You let her ask questions and you answered them as if the answers mattered, which to her they did. You showed her how things work. You gave her something to hold on to. And when someone arrived and moved toward her before she was ready, you put yourself in the space without asking who anyone was. She looked at me steadily. That is the accounting. And I want you to know that what you did, all of it, in the order you did it, was not a small thing. I thought about this. She needed somewhere to sit, I said. Yes, the Empress said, she did. And you gave it to her with no calculation about what it meant or who she was. That is the part that is not small, Sergeant Holt. She held my gaze for a moment that had a specific weight to it, the kind of moment that is complete in itself and doesn't need anything added to it. Then she turned and walked back out of the alcove and into the corridor, and the corridor rearranged itself around her the way it had when she entered, and Marin fell in at her left shoulder, and Shiri appeared from somewhere and took her hand, and the 3 of them moved toward the main doors with the collective purposefulness of people who had a great deal left to do and understood it. Shiri looked back once, near the doors. She raised the hand that wasn't holding her mother's hand, just slightly, just enough to be a wave if you were looking for one. I raised mine back. I went back to my table. I found my place on the inventory pad, which was the canister count, and I had been somewhere in the low 40s when I'd lost the thread. I started over. I counted slowly and carefully, and I made my notes, and then I sat down on the stool that Shiri had been sitting on, and I drank the cold bad coffee, and I thought about what an ordinary afternoon it had been, and what it had turned out to contain. The remainder of the day was the remainder of the day. Resupply request at 1815, evening rounds at 2000. The Kareth border soldiers finished their paperwork and were processed out through a side exit. The patient with the shoulder graze slept through until 2200 and woke up asking about food, which was an excellent sign. I ate a field ration at a corner of the table and watched the climate system fight the cold, and I thought about what the Empress had said, and I thought about a child who had been taught that words are irreversible and you should mean them before you use them, applying that standard to the question of whether something was sweet. I thought about it for a while, and then I put it in the place where you put things that have turned out to be larger than they looked from the inside, and I finished my rounds and I went to sleep. I did not hear anything more about Empress Velshara or the Veth 9 negotiations for 3 weeks. 3 weeks after the ceasefire, I was at my desk in the field billet working through the morning orders, routine material, administrative follow-through, the particular paperwork that accumulates after an engagement the way silt accumulates after a flood. when I found a transfer document embedded in a routine logistics routing package. Transfer documents in the liaison core are unremarkable. The core moves people according to a logic I have spent 15 years trying to understand and have largely made peace with not understanding. Assignments materialize and conclude, and the reasons are usually several administrative layers above the level at which I operated, and the appropriate response is to read the document carefully, note the reporting date, and begin packing. This document was unusual for two reasons. The first was the posting. Compact Interior Diplomatic Support Division, Velon Compact Central Station, permanent attachment with review at 18 months. This was not a posting that materialized from routine administrative logic. It was 3 tiers above my current assignment. It was the kind of posting that required specific sponsorship from specific offices, worked through specific channels over a period of time I had definitely not been working through them, by people who had decided that a particular sergeant with 11 days of border moon experience and a basic proficiency in 3 words of trade tongue was the correct person for it. I stared at the posting for a long time trying to make it make sense, and it didn't make sense. The second was the signature in the authorization field. I read the signature once, then I read it again. The Velon Compact's formal script has a specific register for official authorization documents. It is distinct from ordinary script in the construction of the letter forms and in the weight of the strokes, and anyone who has spent time in a joint liaison environment learns to recognize it because it indicates that the person signing is present in the act, not delegating it. It means, "This is mine, I wrote it." It means what it says. The name in the authorization field was Velshara An. Below the name, in standard, in handwriting that was precise and without ornamentation. Not a small thing. I sat with that for a long time. The billet was quiet in the morning, and the Veth 9 sky through the narrow window was doing something I had watched every morning for 11 days, and still hadn't gotten used to. The moon's atmosphere catching the stars' early light in a way that turned everything amber gold for about 20 minutes before the full sunrise. The light sitting on everything the way a promise sits before it becomes a fact. I thought about a small gray-silver child on a stool at my table, asking about grandmothers and bioscan paddles, and whether the loud disagreements were finished for the day. I thought about the Empress in the requisitions alcove, the amber gold eyes steady and complete, saying, "That is the part that is not small." I thought about field chocolate and closure strips, and the specific quality of a room that changes when someone walks into it who knows how to move through the world without making it wait for her. I thought about a child who had been taught that words are irreversible and you should mean them before you use them. I thought about what it meant that the person who taught her that had put 4 words in the standard language at the bottom of an official authorization document. Then I folded the transfer document carefully and put it in the inner pocket of my field jacket, in the same place where I kept the 2 remaining squares of chocolate from the bar I'd been rationing since day 7. I picked up my orders for the day and I went to work. That's the whole of it. Some moments announce themselves as significant in advance, and they are usually the ones that turn out to be ordinary. The ones that turn out to be significant rarely announce themselves at all. They arrive as an afternoon and a child on a stool, and 2 squares of chocolate and a stool that wasn't being used, and you don't know what they were until they're already past. I did not know who Shiri was. I did not know who her mother was. I did not know what the amber gold eyes in the requisitions alcove were going to record and carry forward into a transfer document on a morning 3 weeks later. I knew she was small and alone and shivering at the edges, and that I had chocolate, and that the stool was there. That was all it was, and it turned out that was enough.